We're just 3 weeks away from the Iowa caucuses, and the polls there are getting more top-heavy. Bernie Sanders has narrowed Hillary Clinton's lead to just 3 points, and Donald Trump either leads or trails Senator Ted Cruz, depending on which poll you look at. But a new poll from USA Today shows a decisive lead for Donald Trump and for Bernie Sanders among millennials. That poll surveyed voters age 18 to 34 on a wide range of issues, and their priorities may surprise you. Susan Page is in Washington. She's the bureau chief for USA Today, and she is in our Washington newsroom and joins us now. Susan, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
So listen, this Sanders and Donald Trump, this horse race, how wide is their lead now among millennials?
So interesting, of course, both of them kind of the outsiders in their field and getting support from young people. With Donald Trump, 26% of Republican millennials say they support Donald Trump. He definitely has a lead. It's not as big a lead as he has among the electorate overall, but you really see something different happening on the Democratic side. We know that Hillary Clinton nationwide has a lead among Democratic voters, but among millennials, it's Bernie Sanders. And here's the most surprising thing we found. Bernie Sanders has a big gender gap. He is supported by women, young women voters by almost 20 percentage points, just by 4 percentage points among younger men voters. So he's benefiting from a gender gap that is the reverse of the ones you might expect, since he's facing a candidate who is trying to become the first woman to be elected president.
And some other interesting notes in this poll, Susan, and I found really interesting. On social issues, these young millennial voters are pretty much all on the same page when it comes to things like violence against African Americans by the police, on the gun control issue. But it is on the foreign policy issues that they sort of diverge.
That's right. We saw a big difference between Republicans and Democrats in this group of millennial voters when it came to fighting terrorism. Republican millennials support the idea of deploying U.S. ground troops to fight ISIS. Democratic millennials are inclined to oppose that. And this is especially notable because on most issues we found a real generational consensus, a kind of agreement across party lines that you don't see among older voters. You know, for instance, on the issue of gun control, universal background checks, very divisive issues with older voters. Among these voters, more than 8 in 10 Republicans and Democrats support the idea of universal background checks.
Yeah, I mean, 82% versus 12% on purchases for guns. And that, I think, is fascinating. The other really interesting number that you have here in your poll, an overwhelming percentage of millennial voters, 80% to 10%, say that the United States should transition to mostly clean or renewable energy by 2030.
And, you know, that's a message to the next president if he or she wants to appeal to these voters, because there's no way this country gets to mostly renewable and clean energy by 2030 without some real national leadership. That's a very ambitious goal. But by 8 to 1, we found that voters under 35 say that's what the United States should do. A lot of concern about climate change, a lot of concern about continuing to rely on fossil fuels.
The other thing a lot of young people are worried about, and I think older people as well, is the economy. But on foreign policy, I think this is really striking. There's less of a consensus when it comes to fighting terrorism. 47% say the United States should commit troops on the ground to combat the Islamic State. 37% disagree. Is there a way for either party to exploit that?
You know, one thing we thought we found with this poll was a concern about terrorism, but a greater concern when it comes to economic issues. And, you know, we find that with older voters, too, that people care most about jobs and the economy, some kind of pocketbook issues. The number 2 issue with millennials is college debt and affordability. That's very particular to their generation. Then you find concern about terrorism. We think that may reflect recent news, you know, the attacks in Paris, the attacks in California that have raised that as an issue. But we wonder if we're going to do 4 of these polls this year targeting millennial voters on this election year. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is, does terrorism recede as an important issue for millennials if we, and as we hope happens, get a period where we feel a little less threatened by terrorist attacks on our soil?
Yeah, and Susan, as we go into this election cycle, I just want for our viewers to understand what you at USA Today are calling the millennial agenda. 82% they want required background checks for all gun purchases. 80% want transition to mostly clean or renewable energy by 2030. 76% want police to wear body cameras to protect American citizens. 68% want reduced sentences for people convicted of nonviolent crimes. This number is very interesting as we look at the rhetoric between with Donald Trump and some of the things that he said about accepting refugees and the things that he said about Mexico. 53% of millennials would accept refugees from foreign conflicts such as Syria, and 52% want to help alleviate extreme poverty in countries to combat extremism. Was this at all surprising to you at all, Susan, before I let you go?
Yes, I mean, we particularly look at that issue on accepting refugees from countries like Syria. We found that by double digits, by a double-digit margin, millennial voters said yes, the United States should be accepting some of these refugees. And they take what we might call a humanitarian approach on foreign policy, and by double digits they say America should try to address extreme poverty as a way to combat extremism, political extremism, in foreign countries.
Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today. Thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Vlad.